Hello, this is Michael Hexter. Welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So this episode I'm calling Ukrainian Neo/Paleo-Nazism, an excuse for Putin and ongoing challenge for Ukrainian democracy. So there's a swirl of discussion. I've also participated in discussions around this online, in social media, and also in some mainstream media about the role of fascists in current Ukraine and in the current Ukrainian government. And there are people, again, this is part of, I think, the general issue that I talked about, where people of the left, people of goodwill in general, have been focusing for a long time on the neo-fascists or neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and they are, I think, unaware of the role that this has played in Putin's own Ukraine strategy, and that they're playing a role in that strategy by, I would say, magnifying the importance of these neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And they're also, I think, in the discussions I've had with people, or arguments I've had with people, they seem to be unaware of the substantial non-Nazi, non-fascist, liberal democratic portion of the Ukrainian polity and Ukrainian life as now, and they seem to be arguing as if the entire project of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian statehood is bound up entirely with Nazism and neo-Nazism. And so this is kind of a, in a way, this is somehow history is living, or it's not quite nostalgia, it's the opposite of nostalgia, but it's a way of living in the past in a way for some people. And I'm not diminishing the dangers of the role of these fascists in either in paramilitary or in military groups in Ukraine. But it's also a matter of understanding right now the proportions of which problem to focus on now, okay, and how to focus on the elephant in the room, so to speak. The proportionate is that an imperialist power which is a nuclear superpower, is invading and erasing the statehood of Ukraine in its own mind. In other words, the leader, Putin, is and is essentially has laid the groundwork for and is executing now a plan of either annexation or demolition of Ukrainian national identity and or statehood overall. And this is if this wasn't clear before to people in the last week or so, it should be clear to people that this is what is happening now. If they read the news, if they are following what's going on, and especially obviously if they're on the ground in Ukraine or in surrounding areas of Eastern Europe. So this is not to say that Ukrainian Nazism and neo-fascism is something to applaud or is something to endorse or is something to ignore. The Ukrainians have had the unfortunate history of being victimized by Stalinism and being treated as a non-entity or as simply to use the Nazi term from Germany, Lebensraum, or basically an empty canvas to structure as the Moscow government wanted, or as the Stalin government wanted, and there was an enormous famine there. It was so. The Ukrainian nationalists turned, in some sense, became collaborators with the Nazis when they invaded the Soviet Union and the Ukrainian Republic, and they also participated in massacres of my people, the Jews, and they have had almost all the grim, psychopathic political tendencies of fascism, expressed them in different forms throughout the history, or certainly in the Second World War, and also, in some instances since then. And so they are not people that I want to align myself with. Obviously I am not in Ukraine. I am not Zelensky, who is also Jewish. I'm Jewish too, who is the president of Ukraine. But I don't. I'm being in my position. I would wish that the Ukrainians would express their nationalism in a way that wasn't fascistic, and they are right now expressing it in a way that's basically liberal democratic, and with elements of also these neo-fascists and neo-Nazis taking part in it. And I am also even open to the idea that we are finding ourselves in the current situation in part because of a rejectionism by fascistic elements in Ukraine of compromise with Putin in negotiating, in diplomatic solutions. Now, I think that we're finding ourselves now in a situation where we're seeing a geopolitical realignment, okay, because basically the moral capital, that the moral authority, maybe is a better word to put it, that Russia had as being the victims of Nazism and also resisting the Nazi invasion of others and paying in blood for the liberation of much of Europe from Nazi domination, including the concentration camps located in Eastern Europe, that they had moral authority, which unfortunately, Stalin also didn't have moral authority in some way or another, but internationally, in terms of the external politics of the Soviet Union, they also had the moral authority of being the non-capitalist superpower that could resist or that could potentially help and did help struggles against the domination by capital of various countries in basically mostly in the developing world. So so they have this and Putin is trying to use that capital, that moral authority of being supposedly an anti-fascist, when he himself is actually now a fascist of a great Russian fascist, a neo-fascist. He doesn't, have the same sentimentality for the Third Reich that some of the Ukrainian fascists do have, and the echoes of that in their symbology and so forth and so on. But he is a dictator and an imperialist dictator, though he doesn't have the same kind of mass party that that the German fascists, the Italian fascists had with you know, enthusiastic sort of paramilitary shock troops. He simply has the control of the Russian state, and he is himself ideologically great Russian white supremacist, you know, right-wing reactionary kleptocrat, all these kind of things. So he's not, you know, but he's trying to, in terms of his external policy, trying to use the authority, the moral authority of whatever there was of the Soviet Union had accumulated, of being the liberator of Europe and also the prime anti-fascist army in the middle of the 20th century. But when we come to the geopolitics and the border region around the Russian nation, these are people who have needed, and this is why I talked about this in a previous episode, the geostrategic balance to be in their favor. And at one point in time, unfortunately, that was the fascists, the Nazis in the period 1933 to 1945, who was the counterbalance to the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire and its domination. So these are peoples who are opposed to Russian domination of their countries. I mean, I don't want to say the peoples, but it seems like most people in those countries are against being dominated by, certainly majorities, big enough majorities to, when there is democracy, they vote out, they tend to vote out the proxies for Russian interests in their countries. So, and they have different languages, different cultures, and than Russia. And so, so anyway, there are people, though, who are not so familiar with this issue and also don't want to think about this idea of geopolitical balance and the national self-determination rights of various smaller nations around the world, and how important it is for that balance to be around, for them to be able to self-determine, have their own have their own democracies, essentially, and to be able to form democracies, because that requires them not to be dominated by an external power. So anyway, we have people who are using the troubling and still present, you know, neo-fascist or neo-Nazi elements like right sector, Azov Battalion. You know, these are groups that are still around in Svoboda, and who are also, you know, anti-Islam, you know, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic in some areas, though they're currently dealing with having they have a Jewish president there, and these are groups that, you know, could again present problems for any democratic forces within that will, if they follow their ideologies, will create problems for a further deepening of Ukrainian democracy. But we are on, so this is where the dynamic is that the big power right now is in that region is the Russian army, and therefore they are trying to impose their will in Ukraine. And so the current move for people who are anti-fascist, but also pro-democracy, pro national sovereignty, and which national sovereignty being a basis for democracy, that that we need to be focusing on resisting Putin's attempt to impose military will on his military will on Ukraine. With it's unclear how much annihilation he wants to do, and how much his system, his military political system, will allow him to do there, and there needs to be a counterweight, unfortunately, a military counterweight to that, until such time as he decides that he wants to negotiate, okay, and he wants to, because of economic reasons or because of military reasons. So, so there needs to be, and there are people who suggest that, oh, diplomacy is the key. Well, diplomacy doesn't exist in isolation from also power dynamics. So a very small country can only go so far with their diplomacy if they are, I mean, right now Ukraine is not a tiny country, but it's not compared to Russia, it's it's about an eighth the size of Russia or so, or the seventh or eighth size of Russia. So it's not able to, there's a big, and also in terms of military power, it's much less powerful. So a much weaker diplomacy helps to, on the margins, to improve a country's position or standing if it has at least something close to the military position. Let's put it this way: if there's vastly different power dynamics, especially if you have a leader like Putin who is sociopathic or psychotic in his, I mean, psychotic is, I don't want to be, but he is sociopathic. He's dictatorial. He's authoritarian. If they, and he will probably only respond if he feels forced, probably by multiple forces. He needs internal forces as well as external forces to within Russia to come to the table. But anyway, some of the forces that will get him to the table are also resistance by Ukrainians, okay, military resistance. And so it's not, to me, it's not part of, it's not wrong to be supporting that, even though there are elements in Ukraine that I don't want to see armed any more than they are. I don't want to see the right sector or Azov Battalion gain any more power in Ukraine than they have. But I can't micromanage that in I mean, it maybe if the countries like Sweden or Germany who are selling missiles and so forth and so on to Ukraine right now, or shipping them to there. I don't know if they're giving them or they're whatever, or selling them. But anyway, that they put some kind of conditions on them and so forth and so on. And I think there should be a policy of aid, conditional aid, including military aid, to make sure that these groups don't, in other words, the informality, some of it is that the Azov Battalion is an informal battalion. It's not an official part of the Ukrainian military, but that there needs to be some conditions put on the arms sales, or at least also a process by which Ukraine is, not only is corruption, there's been sort of one of the conditions that was being discussed about Ukraine was that they had to deal with corruption, but also they need to deal with neo-fascism, or Nazism within their national polity, because it's not that important right now, but it's also not totally unimportant. So so I think this is what I'm presenting here is a reasonable position. Maybe because in its reasonableness, it will appear boring and unattractive to many people, but I think it's reasonable to say the big problem now is Russian imperialism and Russia imposing its will, Putin imposing his will on Ukraine, but then also we need to create the basis for a Ukrainian sovereignty that isn't tied intimately to fascism, okay, and that there is a reckoning with the within Ukraine with the history of fascism and anti-Semitism and a whole bunch of other things, some of which has been started in certain areas, but that still that so it's not simple, but I think that what I'm saying is a reasonable approach, and anyway, some of the people I've been arguing with on Twitter, I believe, will dismiss it because they are so focused on the idea that one can have a zero fascist or a totally non-fascist Ukraine as being, that would, then they would potentially be worthy of our support and so forth and so on, and I can't deliver that to them. There's not, the reality doesn't allow for that currently. Maybe at some future time, but right now, not there. And for that matter, you know, there are other countries where there is some, you know, far right influence and parties and so forth and so on. But it is a long tradition in Ukraine. It does have there is a lot. It stretches back to the Second World War, and there is some continuity there. But it's still, it is not, Ukrainian society is not a fascist society, and that's not, and it's not, certainly not in need of Mr. Putin de-nazifying it, okay? And that's simply a ruse that the imperialist power is taking to impose its will and also destroy the good parts of Ukrainian society, the democracy, the nascent democracy in Ukraine. So anyway, so if you have any thoughts about what I'm talking about here, please share them in the comments, and if you like this video, please like it and on the YouTube button thing. And also please subscribe to Politics 2100 if you're enjoying the content here, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.